What if losing your period wasn't a badge of honor, but a bright red flag? Welcome back to Performance Lab. I'm Dr. Michael Donovan, and today's guest is Dr. Traci Carson, a researcher, educator, and fierce advocate for women's health in endurance sports. We dive into the hidden struggles of female distance runners, such as disordered eating, body image, and why education, not just training plans, might be the missing link. From the science of amenorrhea to the power of wearables and ethics of genetic testing, Traci's work is pushing the conversation forward and empowering women to understand their bodies, their cycles, and their choices. If you coach, train, or love a female athlete, don't miss this one. Traci, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
What's the most memorable cycling experience you've had?
That's a good question. I actually think it was a race I had this year. It was the Noonan Rock and Road Crit. And it was kind of my first time I felt really confident. And then I was able to harness that feeling for the rest of the season. Hopefully the next couple of races coming up too.
Awesome. Well, I know you're now a Cat 2 crit racer, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you've had some success at that level, a few podiums this year.
Yeah, it's been kind of a crazy year. Last year at this time I was Cat 4. I just started racing, and then I just really invested in the racing scene this year and put in a lot of hours and money and time and all those things. And it's been really fun.
Awesome. Well, I want to start at the beginning, sort of what I know of your athletic career, which is rowing at the University of Michigan. You made a decision to stop rowing, and when you talk about the culture of cycling and the culture of women endurance sports in general, and I know we've talked a lot about this, and it framed your research, and so I think it's a good place to start. Tell me about why you decided to stop, being a member of the rowing team, and what that meant for you at the time.
Yeah, that's a hard-hitting first question, Michael. I will dive right in. But anyone who knows me knows I'm quite an open book. I mean, really, my decision to stop rowing my junior year, at the end of my junior year, was really just based on my personal health and issues I was having around disordered eating and body image and highly restrictive eating. But honestly, that started well before college. I guess really the answer is my decision to stop rowing really started in high school because that's where these behaviors really started. And by the time I reached kind of that breaking point during my junior year of college, I was so deep in the disordered eating behaviors, and I hadn't had a menstrual cycle for at that point probably 5 years, but it took me 8 years before I got my menstrual cycle back completely. And yeah, I was really, really anxious, really, really deprived of nutrients, losing strength, didn't sleep well. My life was controlled by my eating or lack thereof. Yeah, I could go on forever, but I can stop there and we can continue the conversation.
Thanks for talking about what was probably a difficult decision at the time, but the reason I started there is because my understanding is that really framed like the rest of your academic career in a way, because you were really passionate about making a difference in what you see as a wrong that can be corrected in women's endurance sports. So how did that shape your approach to addressing mental health, issues with female athletes and your entire PhD essentially? We'll dive more into it, but kind of just big picture.
Yeah, I think as I kind of left my rowing team at the time, and it still took me, honestly, probably a year and a half or 2 years to really dive into getting support and help for my disordered eating and all of those behaviors that were controlling my life at the time. I was just struck by this kind of lack of information and education that I felt like I never received as a young woman, just around my body, around the menstrual cycle warning signs. I feel like now at least a lot of young female athletes understand that if they don't get their menstrual cycle and they're not getting a period, that that is something that is a problem, or that is something that is a key warning sign. That wasn't common knowledge when I was in high school or even in college. And so those were things that I felt really passionate about, kind of as I went through my own recovery. And I wasn't finding the information that I felt like should be available. And I was talking to women, and I wasn't special by any means. Like, my experience wasn't special. And it was happening to so many young women in various different ways. And I just felt like that was something that could easily be prevented or at least intervened on early. And that was a perfect, public health provided the perfect framework for me to address this issue, right? Like prevention, intervention, and, tertiary treatment are the three pillars of public health. And I really wanted to think about this from a prevention standpoint instead of just looking at this issue from like the medical psychology treatment side of things.
And it should be obvious, but I don't think it is obvious. Talk about why it is so detrimental for, especially any hopefully female athletes that might listen to this, why it is so detrimental to not have a period when you're an athlete. I mean, in general, it's not a great thing, but especially from a performance standpoint, it's usually tied with very low body weight and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, and honestly, I think I like that you said very low body weight, because it's not always with low body weight, right? And that's the thing that I think is so important to talk about. So I'm glad you said that, because like what I experienced was technically atypical anorexia, which means anorexia without low body weight enough to be classified as anorexia. But that's so common for female athletes because they tend to have a lot more muscle mass. And so they may not qualify, I'm doing air quotes, qualify for certain eating disorder criteria, but it's because their body composition might, or typically is, depending on the sport, quite different from, their non-athlete peer who doesn't weight train, doesn't, spend that much time building muscle mass and eating protein and things like that. And so, yeah, there are a couple of frameworks that now we have available to us as athletes. The first is the female athlete triad, which really just focused on the three, triad components of low energy availability, meaning not eating enough calories compared to how much you're exercising, low bone density, and menstrual disturbance. But the newer framework, the relative energy deficiency in sport framework, includes 10 more acute performance related consequences of undereating and not having your period. And that can include like lack of coordination, decreased strength, like fatigue, right? Mental, like cognitive impairment. But also there's a framework within that is the 10 more like chronic long-term outcomes, which can include, bone health issues, immune health issues, all of these different types of things. But I think that's important to point out, um, because there are both short-term and long-term consequences. But a lot of people don't recognize that the short-term consequences are actually related to the root issue, which is, under eating. But your first sign of that tends to be menstrual cycle disturbance.
Yeah. I know this is so common, and we say in young women, but I'm sure it's not limited just to young women. And I think in the Instagramic society that we live in, the physique and even more so, even if you're not an athlete, right? Let's talk about the relationship between exercise and body image and self worth, particularly among young women, but again, generalizable probably. Given your background and your in sports psychology and your personal journey, what do you think is the most important thing to sort of monitor to prevent the kinds of things that that is so common, right? I mean, I say that you experienced, but the burnout and the health issues and all those kinds of things. Is there anything as individuals or as coaches or as a community you think could really be done?
I mean, yeah, I could answer that in so many different ways, but one thing that comes to mind, I think that's really important for athletes, and this is kind of more, yeah, coaches and friends and family can kind of have this in the back of their mind when having conversations with you, but really as like a self-assessment is, are you eating and training in a way that is focused on body composition and how you look, or is it truly based on how you want to perform? Because those are very different things, right? If we think about like bodybuilding and figure competitors, they are not um, healthy, right? Like that is not a state of health when they're at their peak, like competition day, right? I don't think any of them would say, wow, I felt the best I've ever felt. I'm the strongest I've ever been. I could perform at my top capacity. Absolutely not. Their sport is their body composition, right? But for an athlete, there is a huge trade off, especially like endurance sports and, um, you know, sports that are kind of longer in duration. You're going to have a significant trade off in performance if you are eating and training to maximize what you look like in your body composition versus are you eating and training in a way that is maximizing your performance. And I think if you sit down that at the end of the day and think about how you are fueling your body, how you are prioritizing training, are you adding training in just for the sake of burning more calories and doing more work, or is it actually have an intention towards performance? I think that is something that, especially as adult athletes like myself, I'm almost 31 years old, right? And maybe I wouldn't ask that of a 16-year-old who's really in like social media culture and developing and growing and have all these competing interests. But I think as adult athletes, like probably many of, us are who would be listening to this, it's really asking yourself that question. Am I doing this for performance or am I doing this just to look a certain way? And I think that's like an interesting flag that can prompt further conversations or, self assessment.
That's great. So let's talk a bit about your research. Can you just begin by explaining in simple terms for our audience what you researched in grad school?
Yeah, so I ended up doing all my research on female distance runners because there are a lot of them and they tend to be a highly motivated population. So they are somewhat easier to research than other types of athletes. And they're also, well known for striving for low body fat mass, lean builds, right? There's this kind of runner body image type that seems to be on the top of their minds that they're trying to achieve. And so I was really interested for my dissertation work in, risk factors for disordered eating and trying to achieve this like ideal athlete body, whatever that is for that person, because that tends to, especially in female distance runners, right? This might look different in other sports, but for female distance runners, the ideal athlete body, from what the women in my studies told me, was like very lean, somewhat muscular, but have visible abs, have like this sense of leanness. Um, and so that was the first part, was really just understanding what contributes to that idea. Like, how do women grow up and believe that they need to train a lot, eat less, and have this ideal body type to be successful in their sport? And then the second part of my dissertation work really looked at the relative energy deficiency framework in female runners specifically, and what are risk factors for developing REDs. But then within that, what types of essentially profiles of REDs presented. So, right, I mentioned there are 10 acute outcomes, there are 10 chronic outcomes, right? We wouldn't expect an athlete to show up with all 10 acute and all 10 chronic outcomes at the same time. That would be wild, right? So, within that very large framework, what types of profiles emerged? So, what types of key outcomes emerged and looked at, we found three different kind of profiles of REDs that presented in female runners. So that those are kind of like the two different methodological aims.
And what did you find?
Well, for the kind of the first part of my dissertation, more around risk factors for developing disordered eating, body image, and mind you, this was in college age women specifically. So we're not talking about like middle aged, even in their 30s age women. This was how were you in college and then high school, because we did ask about high school as well. So we found that, key contributors to shaping a young woman's mind around body image and food, coaches play a huge role, not surprisingly, but there hasn't been a lot published on that, the role that coaches play, which may seem obvious to anybody who's ever been a young athlete, that your coach is highly influential on you. But there are a lot of ways that coaches can either positively or negatively affect the way somebody sees their body, influence food and dieting behaviors. Um, we also found that just the culture of the sport itself, right? Running culture is pretty deep. It has deep roots. And so these myths around running performance and body type and body fat and body composition seem to kind of trickle down through the generations of coaches to athletes, right? The idea that like lighter is faster. That's like the mantra in running, lighter is faster. And it's like to a certain point, but you go past that point and lighter is not faster if you are not fueling your body. And so those were some key themes that emerged. And that was all qualitative work. And I really, really enjoyed sitting down and having those one-on-one conversations with athletes. It was incredibly interesting and fulfilling work. And then the second piece was more this quantitative methodological aim that we use latent class analysis and had athletes, 300 college age athletes, fill out these long surveys. And mind you, this was like 6.5 years ago now, so some of the details are slightly fuzzy. But we had over 250 responses, and we looked at profiles of these college runners. And we found that across the board, runners who qualified for the study, meaning that they had disordered eating or a history of RED-S, that they self-reported highly anxious, highly anxious, a lot of menstrual disturbance, meaning they either had 3 to 6 months of missing periods at a certain during their college years. Without the use of birth control, because that's a whole nother component that we should talk about when we talk about missing periods. That's missing periods not on birth control, because it's easy to be on a type of birth control where you don't get a period. We're not talking about that. We're talking about your body has ceased menstruation because it does not have enough energy to function. And then also within that, we found significant amounts of bone stress fractures, right? That's a huge outcome related to undereating, overtraining. With that usually comes a missed menstrual cycle, right? That's like the crux of the female athlete triad. That's like first what was recognized. So we certainly validated that in our population, that is still happening very frequently. But the other things that came out were like that similar profile with the addition of a lot of immune issues. So getting sick all the time. That was something that was highly reported. That, kind of overall, the takeaway was a lot of these athletes are not very healthy, which is a bummer, like these are young NCAA distance runners, women, young women, highly educated, right? Most of them are high SES background, all those demographic variables we had as well. And they're not the healthiest. They have a lot of health challenges that could be prevented.
Right.
And that was something that definitely stuck with me.
For sure. And I think one of the things that we've talked about in the past as well is you were looking at or discussing just now the acute effects, right, in that moment. But we do talk as a society about the concerns of prolonged use of contraception and various birth control things, primarily because of the way that it alters your natural hormones, right? And just by having a low body fat and putting yourself in a state of amenorrhea over a duration, you're also altering your long term potentially, right? Your long term hormonal if you will, right? And it can have long term effects as well. Am I right in? Did I get some of that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty liberal on the use of birth control for many reasons. I definitely a different physiologic state um, of using birth control to suppress your menstrual cycle versus not being on birth control, and your body is so deprived of um, literal energy that it ceases to produce a menstrual cycle. I think the topic of birth control in athletes is really interesting and definitely has come up a lot lately on social media, in the media. I could talk about this all day, but there's not a lot of evidence to show that birth control affects performance, right? We're talking kind of more like acute performance. Um, Christy Elliott Sale, the number one expert on this topic in the UK, has done a couple of meta-analyses around these subjects, and nothing has shown that birth control affects performance um, in any specific way. I think she's also looked into this idea of like cycle syncing with exercise and training, and shown that that's not really there isn't any strong evidence to show that women should quote unquote be training in sync with their cycle. Now that doesn't mean that people don't feel like individual level differences, right? That's like population level effect versus like how do you feel in your own body. Obviously, like if you feel a certain way in your body around certain times of your cycle, honor that. That's great. But a lot of people I think are profiting off this idea right now that you should train in sync with your cycle, and that's like the next way to you know produce these performance effects, but the evidence isn't quite there for that, although I think the concept is quite interesting. But birth control itself, I mean, right, this is kind of like public health, like the public health root in me, but birth control has given women so many amazing things over the decades, right? Like it's given women a lot of freedom and control over their reproductive health and decision making around their own bodies. But certainly there are pros and cons, right? I don't think anybody could sit here and say birth control is, the most amazing thing that's ever been invented. It certainly is not. It certainly comes with pros and cons, but I really think that's such a individual decision because everyone's menstrual cycle is so different. I mean, right, we can talk about these like averages and, like 21 to 38 days is like a quote unquote normal cycle and all these things. But even within that, there's so much variation for women. Um, and I think it's like an amazing tool that we have available, especially um, for athletes who do have a lot of, PMS type symptoms and all that. It can help in a lot of ways, but um, I could
So,
go on for the rest.
are there long term effects outside of birth control um, of not having your period?
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
you were looking again at that acute, but if you followed up in a long term study with those athletes 10 years later, 15 years later, what would you expect to see versus a control group, or maybe even athletes who are just not experiencing that? Right, that would be a
Mhm.
great control group. Those
Yeah.
who are running a lot but not experiencing the negative things.
Yeah, there's actually not very much research on that, which is kind of wild. The like long-term effects, like long-term meaning more than like 4 or 5 years out, right? And I think that that's so interesting and kind of was what I have wanted to do for a long time is more work in that area. The funding is not quite there, is what I'll tell you about that research question. The intersection of female aging and sport science is not the most fundable topic. Um, I think what's left is a lot of questions around the effect on fertility, um, the effect on thyroid health, we know the effect on bone health, right? That is what we do know. We know that not having a menstrual cycle for a relatively long amount of time is going to affect your bone health, probably, like not in every single person. And that is associated with risk of, bone fractures, bone breaks. And we definitely know that, especially in older women, a bone fracture or bone break is like the number one sign of early mortality, right? Um, and so that is the outcome that has been focused on the most. But I'm really interested in looking at, like I mentioned, thyroid and fertility, which are linked, intrinsically linked. But there isn't really enough research there, especially, like I said, like longer term. Um, we need to follow women over time, which is something that some large cohort studies do well, but not specifically, to female athletes, and not specifically to the question of amenorrhea or under fueling for a long period of time, and then what happens later in life. It's really kind of a black box right now.
Is that partly due to the siloed nature of research funding, that like sports science is more like this, several month period that we're going to study these athletes, and then you have, more longitudinal public health related studies that are studying over multiple years?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough, which, when you're, at least my experience, I had an incredible PhD experience at Michigan. It was great. I had amazing advisors. I was so supported. Had all the resources in the world, right? Which is not everyone's experience, I know. But I think part of that was like, yeah, you can totally research this topic. This is super innovative. You can have, a kinesiologist as an advisor and a methodologist in survey methods and two epidemiologists and a social scientist, and all these people come together. And you can do that. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. And it's exactly what I did. And then you leave your beautiful little University of Michigan bubble and you realize you can't do that anymore. It doesn't work that way. You can't get funding to do that. Funding mechanisms don't work across all those silos that you could work across in your PhD. It just, it wasn't, it was honestly really tough because you finish your dissertation and you're like, wow, it went really well. I did it in 3.5 years. I'm really good at this. And then you realize you can't do that work anywhere else, which I know is kind of a over exaggeration, but just the challenge of it was quite, larger than I had expected. And so then, yeah, you have to start, working within kind of one of those specialty areas and not across all of them at once. And so, um, I went on to work more specifically in women's health because I felt like that is where I could do the most good and was most drawn to, um, you know, instead of sports science specifically, or instead of epidemiology specifically, or instead of, um, being a methodologist specifically. And so I kind of landed more in this women's health space, but that means that I'm not so much in the sports science side of things anymore.
Right. But that's the choice we as PhD scientists have to make, right? Is where, how can you translate the lab to life, right? And what impact, it's great to have a lot of publications, and maybe if you were in sports science, you'd have more, more publications in PubMed or something, but not as much of an impact on the world, which is what more of us care about than than just publications outside of academia, right? So you you kind of pivoted away from sports science and really into women's health, and you're still engaged in research in your current capacity. But before we talk about that, what you were working for kind of an app, right? Developing an app to provide women's health information for more broadly. Was that, did I get that right?
I'm sorry, you're cutting up so much. I'm having a really hard time
Hmm.
hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Maybe try again. Your screen went blurry, and then it was just really choppy.
Hmm. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Cool. All right. I think we're back.
Sorry
Technical
about that.
difficulties today. So I was just saying, out of grad school, you worked for this organization that was providing more breadth of women's health dissemination through the
Mhm.
creation of an app. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so that was a really fun time. So right before that, I was doing a postdoc at NYU, but it was right when the second COVID variant hit, and I was living in New York City, and I was locked away in this tiny little apartment that I couldn't afford, and it was just not a great time. So I was like, gotta get out of here. Let's do something different. But living in Brooklyn really kind of led me to be interested in tech because a bunch of my friends were in tech. It seemed like this really innovative, fast paced, interesting, kind of almost in some ways like the opposite of academic work, right? Like really high paced and hit the ground running. You got to turn things over really quickly. And I was really drawn to that. And so I found this company that was focusing on women's health education in a pretty progressive way, which I was really drawn to. And so I just messaged the CEO like 3 or 4 times and told her why I wanted to work for her and what I could offer and all these things. And ended up getting a position with that company and was the lead of education and research. And so I was essentially a science writer for about a year and a half and learned so much about women's health, like across the spectrum from contraception through menopause, essentially. But we focused mostly on fertility and pregnancy. And yeah, it was a really cool experience. Learned so much about like startups and tech. We were a company of about 11 people. Um, Unfortunately, we didn't make it as a startup. So that ended my time there. We weren't financially able to stay afloat, as many startups experience that challenge. But um, it was really cool. And I would love to do something like that again, honestly, because it's such a fun environment to work in a startup with so many creative, really smart people who want to make a difference and want to do it quickly, which was just really fun.
Yeah. A lot of the people I'm talking to are scientists working in the biotech startup space and just startup space in general. And many of them have had failures, a lot around funding. Even the best ideas, it's a tough funding environment, particularly right now, to get VC funding and things like that. What advice would you have for someone, let's say a second or third year PhD student who wants to get into that space when they finish? Is there anything that you would might help them, from a thought process or skills they could develop? The stereotype of a lot of PhDs is introverts, and you have to do a lot of pitching in if you're a CEO or COO or something like that. So maybe do a Toastmasters something, where you get out of your shell. Or what advice would you have for someone that really wants to thrive in that space?
Yeah, I think, whether it's like starting your own startup or working for one, I think, and I'm not saying I'm great at this by any means, but creating some kind of identity online, just having an Instagram, having a LinkedIn, connecting with people, just like seeing what's out there. Because I feel like, and this is, not across all types of startups, of course, but it's really like having a pulse on what people need and want. And I think social media is a way that you can get that information. But I think also if you're, in the thick of the dissertation, and it's really how do you make your work mm, relatable to people? Like not relatable to people in your cohort, like relatable to people in your hometown, like people that you're friends with outside of academia. Um, right? We talk about this with like health sciences and epi all the time, but how do you like make your research interpretable, like meaningful to people? I was talking with a colleague today, like why use, you know, particular methods when the output is not easily interpretable, right? Because if you're reporting findings that are not interpretable, the effect measures are not interpretable to the everyday person, that's not very meaningful to anybody outside your little academic world. So I think about making your work at least like have an impact on people that you care about, right? I mean, for example, like, I mean, my dissertation topic was a bit more um, relatable, I think, to a lot of people than maybe some others. But right, like going out and talking to high schools, going out and talking to clubs at your school, going out and doing like, you know, your university's version of a TED Talk type of thing. Like make your work um, interesting to people. And if you have a hard time making your work interesting to other people and getting their attention, maybe work on that. Maybe that's something you can work on, adding elements to your research that um, affect people in their personal lives, because that's how I think you're going to get people interested in what you're doing. Anybody can sit in a lab and do whatever petri dishes of whatever they do. I don't do that type of work, but not everyone can spend, you know, whatever it is, 3 to 7 years on a dissertation that actually kind of reaches people where they are.
Yeah. In women's health, you said you learned a lot in the time when you were kind of director of research. What were the surprising things that you've been kind of adjacent to that for a long time? Were there some things that you discovered that you were like, wow, how did I not know this for the last 20 years?
So many things. And I think that's what led me to be even more passionate about women's health and women's health education, because there's so many things that like we just don't grow up learning as women. And I can only speak to like my generation of women, of course. But something that I found so interesting and I'm like somewhat obsessed with is like the mechanism of action of birth control. Like we give women birth control, we give women at 15 birth control, we give women IUDs, we give them, you know, Nexplanon implants in their arm. But how many women can tell you how it actually works to prevent pregnancy? Like the actual mechanism. And that's something I dove into really deeply in that role, was the mechanism and trying to be able to like explain it in a way that is really easy to understand. Um, Especially something like a copper IUD. Copper IUDs do not have the best reputation. A lot of people don't like them, but right, it is a non-hormonal option. A lot of women are drawn to non-hormonal options, and that is the most effective non-hormonal option. It's like 99 point something percent effective against pregnancy. It's more effective than a tubal, you know, getting your tubes tied, essentially. But how many women could tell you how it actually works? It's a copper device inserted into your uterus, right? Like that's crazy. And so that's something I dove into and found really fascinating. And think that like we should be teaching this across the board, everywhere, to everyone, right? These options are amazing and they really work, but I think women should be empowered to understand how and why they work. Or else you have this, you're taking this foreign object, you know, in a pill or in a implant or in a shot or having a more permanent type IUD device. But I think if we taught women how they actually worked and why they actually work, there's like more empowerment around that than just saying, hey, you should take this. And like, but you don't really understand what's happening in your body.
I think as a public health and medical community, I think sometimes we think, well, people wouldn't understand, or they don't need to know how it works, but I think there would be a lot more adherence and looking
Mm-hmm.
for things if there wasn't this just black box of like, just take it, take this pill, take that, you do this thing, it works, right?
Yeah.
Here's what the research has shown. what are some other areas outside of reproductive health, women's health, just health in general, that there's and there's obviously some very complicated biomechanical and physiological mechanisms that even the top scientists don't completely understand how it happens. So that's not what I'm talking about. But just simple things. Is there anything else that comes to mind that people could could understand easily and might be beneficial?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what comes to mind for me is just like, I work with the psychiatrist here as well, just like any medication, you know, like SSRIs, even psychotropic medications, like anything that you're putting into your body and you don't really understand what it's going to do. And I'm not like anti-medication by any means, but I just think that we could do a lot better job with like educating people around it and side effects and dosing and all of that. And um, you know, contraindications and interactions with medications and all of that. I think it's so important, but so often it's just like, hey, this will help you. It might, but I would like to know more about it. Um, and so I think just a lot more education around any type of medication or anything we're putting into our bodies that then is there, and there will often be side effects with that or ways that it affects you that you may not be prepared for. And so I think that's a huge area. So not so much on like the health behavior side of things, but um, just in terms of patient education and really patient like autonomy and empowerment and all that.
Yeah, and I think understanding the side effects is so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of highlighted in my mind by the fact that the main erectile dysfunction drug, Viagra, right, was not designed for that. That was a convenient side effect of that drug, right? And I mean, you could probably come up with a dozen examples like that. GLP-1, weight
Just
loss drugs now are that were not designed as weight loss drugs, right? But that's what they've become. And yeah, I mean,
yeah,
especially when we talk about mental health, drugs for anxiety and depression and those kinds of things, a lot of the side effects of a drug that's supposed to, treat anxiety is depression or,
mm-hmm.
hopelessness and some severe, I mean, the brain is a very complex thing that we have not completely
Yeah.
figured out. But yeah. So tell me about what you're currently doing with Mayhec.
Yeah. So I am currently in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where I met you and Heather. Um, and I work at Mayhec, which is the Mountain Area Health Education Center. So it's one of North Carolina's state AHECs, which is area health centers. And so we're the mountain side because we're the western region. And we serve primarily Medicare and Medicaid patients. We are also newly an FQHC, so federally qualified health center, which means we can treat anybody who, with or without insurance, and provide more resources than maybe some other health centers could to those types of patients. I'm the director of the research division at Mayhec. And so in that role, I primarily oversee GME research for all the residents and fellows. So the graduate medical education research, all of the residents and fellows are required to do some type of, they call it scholarship work, right? It's not all like research work, it's quality improvement work, other types of projects that they can do to fulfill those requirements. But then I also work specifically with the maternal fetal medicine residents because they have like an entire thesis requirement for their fellowship. So it's a lot, you know, larger of a workload than some of what our residents do. And then on top of the GME work, I manage a team of 5 researchers, and I've been here about 6 months now, so I'm just starting to kind of carve out some of my own work. I hope to do some more projects around contraception, which is what I'm really passionate about. And really understanding like rural access barriers to contraception for women. There's a lot of cool work going on here in North Carolina where now pharmacists can prescribe contraception, which is really cool. So that helps to remove some barriers for women who live in more remote regions of Western North Carolina. They don't have to go to a doctor every time. They can go to a pharmacist, which is really great. Um, and then, yeah, I'm also working on some sport related things too, which I didn't know if I'd be able to do here at Mayhec, but there's some other providers in our sports medicine clinic who are interested in research. And so I've been able to get some projects. They're very early phases, but another project with female runners looking at like pelvic floor dysfunction after ultra events, and then a project on disordered eating in college athletes. So lots, research moves at a slow pace. So they are early stages, but hopefully we'll get done by 2026 or 7, if we're being honest.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'd like to talk about some things. We've talked about the areas you're an expert in and areas you know a lot about. And I like to talk about things in the future that we'll probably guess wrong, right? But I like to, just kind of think about the future. And you've worked in academia and in digital health. How do you see technology, whether it's AI or it's devices or it's, health tech, fitness tech, reshaping the landscape of particularly health education? I'm sorry, productive health education and care.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for one, it can serve a really great purpose in expanding access. So, right, I'm kind of in the mind now working in Western North Carolina. Um, so many of our counties are rural counties and they don't have a lot of access. A huge issue in Western North Carolina is access to um, like specialized OB-GYNs. So specifically like maternal fetal medicine doctors are a huge shortage of them. And just like transportation, like the 2 to 3 hours to get to one of these specialists is a huge barrier for a lot of women who already don't have a lot of resources to do so. And so I think it can serve a huge opportunity in like various iterations of like telehealth access, and even something as innovative perhaps as like telehealth, or being able to send out like sonogram type equipment to women and being able to look at like very high risk pregnancies without somebody having to drive 3 hours while they have a very high risk pregnancy and are on bed rest or any of these types of things. And so I think that will serve women in great ways. And I think it doesn't even have to be like this super, super high tech innovation. It's really just like, how can we use tech and continue to use it to improve access? I think is more simple than we realize. It usually comes down to funding and money, right? Grants, money, access, all of these things. But then kind of on, you didn't ask me this, but on the other the flip side, more towards like thinking about wearable data and technology for like female athlete health and all of that. I think it's a really interesting double-edged sword, which I'm certainly not the first person to ever have this thought, but just like the potential downsides of so much wearable technology and so much data, and having that at the fingertips of an athlete who is maybe young. And we've seen this come up with like continuous glucose monitor use and like inappropriate use of those in athletes, and how do we interpret those data in a way that actually is helpful for athletes versus how it's helpful for a diabetic person who is sedentary, and using that information differently. So I think we're going to have a lot of work to do around helpful and useful interpretation of all these data sources that are at our fingertips.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah. And at the college level,
Mm-hmm.
maybe you have a sport science expert, right? On, that's that's probably serving all of the teams, right? Like one person, and the coaches aren't necessarily knowledgeable about
Mhm.
data interpretation and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. And it's still we're still early phase, so it does fall on the athlete themselves. And if they graduate to graduate from college, but graduate to a higher level of athletics, they probably would have a trainer or someone who's looking at that, so they wouldn't even have to look at it. But
Yeah.
just because you mentioned that, I think it's a great point. Data overload in general is is an issue and can be counterproductive. What would you say, like, to if someone asked you, or back 6 or 7 years ago when you were doing your PhD, and said, I have this Whoop band or whatever, and it's giving me all this information, and it's kind of overwhelming. Like, what would you say are the few data points that they should pay attention to?
Mm. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what Whoop has. I just got the Aura ring like a few months ago.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I mean, pick your device, but in general, I mean, we were probably talking HRV and calorie expenditure and sleep and those kinds of things, right?
like resting heart rate at sleep, I think is interesting. HRV, if it's measured well, which is not always the case for a lot of these devices, I don't think they do a great job yet. It's interesting to have the Aura ring. I've had the Whoop in the past, but it's been a while, so that's why I couldn't remember everything. But yeah, I think like resting heart rate, especially while you're sleeping, and then any sleep data. The Aura ring gives like very in-depth sleep data, which I really enjoy. Except sometimes it stresses me out, and then I'm like, that can't be helping my sleep. um, and yeah, I think yeah, like steps to a certain degree. I don't love just looking at calories burned because sometimes it's like, what's like, it's not always helpful and can be um, like a little, can get a little obsessive. Maybe I'm just talking for myself. But yeah, I think some of these devices give so many data points. Even like the Aura ring, sometimes I'm like, this is a lot of stuff. I don't look at all of it every day, all the time, right? Like the main screen will tell you kind of the main key points. I do love though that it has like a cycle tracking feature, like temperature tracking. That is why I got this ring because I thought that was really interesting and innovative, and it's very accurate. I did not think it would be that accurate at predicting. It'll predict the first day of your cycle and it'll predict ovulation. That's been really interesting to use. So for women, it's a great like additional metric, especially if you're on birth control, because you may not be getting a menstrual bleed, like a period bleed, but it can still help you see if you're ovulating or not, which is really cool.
And I think for diseases, infectious diseases that cause
Mm.
temperature variation, fevers, and things like that. I know several friends of mine diagnosed that they had COVID
Mm.
by several years ago because of their they went in their kitchen in the morning and said, "Honey, I think I have COVID." And they were like, "What do you mean? You don't have any symptoms?" And you're like, "Yeah, well, I have the baseline data to know that my body temperature is elevated right now." So
Hmm.
it's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, that's been interesting to see kind of data points come out around these wearables and predicting COVID, and um, it's been useful for some.
Yeah. I just have one more futuristic question about kind of in the seat that you're in right now. Personalized medicine and genetic testing is another thing that we're going to see more and more of. How do you see that playing into the future of reproductive health management and care?
Yeah, this is definitely not my area, like genetic, um, kind of in precision medicine in general, but I have spent enough time with our MFM doctors to hear about their take on this. And I think what I find really interesting is, I mean, the potential to, understand before your child is born, like potential risk factors that they may or may not carry. But I think really it's useful for women and their partner, whoever they're going to be having a child with, to understand what risk factors they bring to a pregnancy and what that could look like. Um, there's many, many, many ethical conversations that you could have around that specific topic in general. Um, but I do think, like, my opinion is that, like, having the information at least allows you to make informed choices and um, be better prepared for your pregnancy and then birth, if that is, how things move forward. And so I think that's interesting. Also, a little bit different, but how that spills over into IVF and all of the really, what word should I use? Interesting conversations that have come out in the news lately around IVF. But I think reproductive technology will have a really interesting, not even so far off future, but near future. And I'm not, a reproductive endocrinologist by any means, but that is over my head and above my pay grade. But I think we'll see a lot of interesting and very challenging conversations come out around reproductive technology in the next 10 to 20 years. And challenge, how that will ruffle feathers in various communities across politics and religion and all of that. But I think it's a really interesting space for those doctors to be in, to put it lightly.
Absolutely. So as a successful female scientist who has transitioned back into sort of public health, I think my final question is, what advice would you have for someone, maybe a high school student, looking at a career in science or in public health or in medicine or these kinds of things, knowing, from your perspective, sort of where these areas might go? Because again, I mean, we're, I think, close to an inflection point in many of these areas where, technology and genetics and these kinds of things are really going to just exponentially change from, now to 2034 and beyond, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, if you're pursuing undergrad and then grad school, you're talking about coming out in about 10 years or so, especially if you do a postdoc. So what it would just, yeah, again, what advice would you have for someone that's considering that kind of career?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I was in high school, I never thought I would do grad school in science. I hated science. I hated math. I was not interested in any of this. So like, also let yourself find the path that's right for you. But I think really my advice is do a PhD, not an MD. Because look at us, we're talking at 3:30 in the afternoon on a on a Monday. No, I'm kidding, but not really. No, I think why I say that is, and my brother's an MD and we're very close, and so I'm allowed to say this, but PhD, you learn how to question what you're told, and you are encouraged to pick things apart and like ask a lot of questions, be really curious, try to prove your point. And I think you learn a lot about how to be like a critical consumer of information and a skeptical consumer of information, for better or worse. Sometimes people take that a little far. I know we all know those types of people. But I think in that path versus an MD, you can really like push the boundaries a bit and really ask a lot of hard questions and be the devil's advocate in a lot of situations. And, in a traditional MD path, your role is different. Your role is to learn the science that you're taught, and your role is to keep people alive, which is great. But if you're somebody who really wants to kind of push the envelope and be a little bit more progressive in the way that you approach science, um, at least from my experience and where I was trained, I was able to do that. And so it just depends on the type of work you really want to do. But ask a lot of questions and don't believe any article anybody ever sends you. I'm not talking about peer reviewed articles. I'm talking about like, so and so sent you this article from the Atlantic or the New York Times. And I think growing up and learning that like um, you have to do a lot more work than just read popular media articles and to learn things is also like a good lesson. Um, like read the original source is a good place to start, I think, because it's not easy to read a lot of those original sources. But if you can get in the mind of like critically consuming things, um, it'll set you up for that type of work, I guess.
It's great advice.
And that wasn't me there. Like that wasn't me until I was about 22. So it took me a while to get there.
Yeah. One of the final questions I like to ask, and I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way, but I like to ask, what are three words that capture your approach to life? But I want to change that for you and say, what are three words that capture your approach to research or science?
Okay. Um, Curiosity, skepticism, and like passion. I think that's a cheesy word. I don't really like that word. Um, Drive, I guess. Like all my research work comes from like some personal um, place of like feeling like I want to like figure this out, or like this is personal to me and I care about it so much that like I need to figure this out.
Yeah.
So finding whatever that is.
Yeah, I love that. I think another thing that's become a little trite is like, what's your story? You know? And sometimes that story is kind of made up. Like it's not fiction, but it's like you're trying too hard, you know? And I think
Hmm.
that resonates in terms of like passion, in a way of like it was important to you to follow this path because of who you are, of your story, right? It wasn't just an intellectual curiosity. It was like, I want to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, but do you ever find I'm the host now, Michael. Do you ever find do you ever find that like I feel like I'm almost at a point where like me telling that story almost like keeps me in that story, and I'm almost at a point where like I'm ready to let go of that story and like have the next chapter and be like, yeah, that happened to me, but it's not like my story. It's like that was young Tracy and what she went through, and I turned that into like who I am now, or like it helped me become who I am now. But my story is now like, what have I done with it? Not like what happened to me.
I love that, and I mean, I don't know if it's novel, but it is underrepresented when we talk about the story that our life is not a short story; it's a
Mhm.
novel, right? And that was a chapter, and then you turn the page, and then there's more, and it's not usually the same thing. That would be a very boring book if it was just the same thing, chapter after chapter, right? So yeah, I think it's absolutely something that tethers people to something that they were before, you know. And one of my good friends, a coach, talks about authenticity, and I was talking with this to another friend, and he said, well, that sounds more like alignment to me. But authenticity often we define as something like being true to yourself, right? Like representing, you know. And he redefined it as being true to your future self.
Mm.
And if you're clear on like who you want to become, then your actions between now and whenever you become that need to be aligned in that direction, not retrospective towards what you were and how you know the story that you had. So yeah, it's an
Yeah, I
interesting
like that a
question.
lot. I think there's a maybe it's just like me turning 30, or maybe it's like this new chapter of life or whatever it is, but there's like, yeah, that was my story, but that doesn't define, yeah, like where I'm going next. Um, and some of those traits that I had in my story that I tell, I don't want them anymore, like they were limiting. And so I
Sure,
want to have new, um, like new verbiage around it, I guess.
sure. Well, thank you very much, Tracy. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah, thank you.
Where can people find you on social media or wherever if they want to reach out?
Sure. So Instagram is what I primarily use. It's just Tracy with an I underscore Carson on Instagram.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any final words or thoughts before we sign off today?
No, I'm gonna go see who won the Tour de France today. The stage. Sorry, who won the stage? Um, and yeah, that's been keeping me uh, interested the last week or so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tracy.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Performance Lab. I'm Dr. Michael Donovan, reminding you that peak performance is a journey, not a destination. For more cutting-edge insights and actionable tips, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media. Until next time, keep pushing your limits and stay tuned to the Performance Lab.